Hi, thank you for having me at DynamicsCon for my session on AL development design patterns for the future. Maybe a few words on me, and I'm Waldo from Belgium. I blog once in a while, and I mainly am a partner in Belgium that basically implements customers with Business Central. On top of that, I sometimes also do some training. Last couple of months, mainly on DevOps, but basically just anything technical on Business Central. Today, we are going to talk about design patterns. And let's dig in design patterns a little bit more. What are design patterns? Well, design patterns, for starters, is actually a very normal thing in any kind of language, any kind of programming language. And it should also be quite obvious for Business Central language. In software engineering, a design pattern is basically just a general reusable solution to a commonly occurring problem, or so Wikipedia says. If you translate that to Business Central, or can I say maybe nav, well, we see these awful screenshots. That is the previous version, I know, but it kind of indicates what we have been dealing with for a lot of years already. And what you clearly see here is a pattern that implements actually the same thing in different entities. And the thing is a number series, right? Just one of the examples of the many, many patterns that are actually already in Business Central. And lucky for you, there is already a Wikipedia page that describes actually a lot of design patterns. Now, this Wikipedia page, there's one caveat, and that is actually it's quite old. It intentionally says this slide, it's a nav design patterns, and yeah, it was being built back in the days when we still were talking about nav. Good news is parts of them, and actually most of these patterns are still very valid. And that's why I really want you to check out this Wikipedia page in the many, many design patterns that we have. A few examples on the very valid pattern that we have is, for instance, the master data, like customer, item, contact. All these kind of things are still obviously valid. But if you have your own entity, you actually should implement it quite the same way. Now, having this Wikipedia page and the description of how this is done, and let me show you that as an example. Then now you have a description on how you should implement this kind of pattern your way. So if you like, we are going to have an example on containers. If that is a new entity, well, that is master data and should be implemented this way. And a few examples is you should implement number series. It should have a description. It should have a search description, and all these kind of things. And the Wikipedia has got quite a lot of these patterns. Another example is the setup. How do I implement this kind of singleton pattern in Business Central? Journals, you must have heard about journals, and maybe you want to implement your own journals or posting routine and so on, right? And there are really a lot of things that were already there in the product in nav. And when we move to Business Central and we move to nav and AL code, still the same principles can be used. And this Wikipedia page has got loads of examples that are still very valid for you to implement. I encourage you a lot to look at this Wikipedia page and look at all these examples and learn from it as a reference for having design patterns. Mm-hmm. Now, do remember that there are also invalid examples. Basically, we have moved to a new architecture, And while we were actually implementing certain things, and I could find 2 examples, and actually only 2 examples. While we were working in nav back in the days, we really had to find some patterns that made it easy for us to be able to upgrade. The hook pattern is actually an example of that, and how actually completely redundant. You should not do anything with the hook pattern anymore, because now we have apps and we have events and so on that basically just replaces whatever we were facilitating with the hook pattern. Same for upgrades. Upgrades are being done completely different now. So this upgrade pattern is completely invalid now as we speak. Now, I want to build a little bit on this. So we have an entire collection, and I'm talking about maybe 50 or 60 design patterns already being described in a wiki for you. But what about this one problem, this one thing that's actually a collection of a lot of things? What about posting routines? A posting routine, you must have seen it. When you press post on a document, now this post is actually going to create a journal, which is going to go through a series of code units, like this checked line, the post batch. And if you compare posting a sales document with posting a purchase document, it's pretty much the same. And then you compare it going to like the job journal and posting a job journal line, it's again pretty much the same. And you can already guess, like, yeah, we actually are talking about, again, design patterns, and a lot of design patterns. And what we are actually also talking about is if we would implement our own posting routine on our own entity, let's say containers, well, then we need to implement it quite the same way. And we also need to create those code units, those check code units, post line code units. And yeah, the pattern is already there. And we need to facilitate it. It's kind of like the same code. And that is where we actually talk about boilerplate code, right? Now, in the programming world, boilerplate code is those sections of code that you repeatedly have to create for different entities. Now, I would like to introduce to you a new tool that is called Mdal or Mdal. Now, the AL obviously comes from AL, the language that we use for creating apps for Business Central. The MD comes from model-driven AL. And when we drill a little bit into model-driven engineering, well, it's, again, in the simple words said, base yourself on models that you already know to face a problem, right? Again, applying design patterns. Now, this MDAL tool is going to foresee this boilerplate code. These models is going to actually create that for you based on the entities that you might want to create. Again, the example, containers. So if I would like to create a new entity, containers, I might want to create a posting routine to my container ledger entry. So I need the container journal. I need my code units. I even need my container table. And if I have a container table, I probably need a card page and a list page. So you see there are already quite a lot of objects that I already need and create. And that's basically always the same for every kind of entity that we would create, right? So that's boilerplate code. What if we could have a tool that generates those boilerplate for us? Even more, if I define a model and then basically just press generate my code and have a compilable application already for me generated. I guess this calls for some kind of demo. So let me switch to an example that I've prepared here. Now, you can already see this kind of like looks like an AL app in Visual Studio Code. So I have my my symbols. I have my app.json. This is going to be an Mdal demo. But what is a little bit out of context here is this Mdal file. Normally we would have AL files if you would compile to an app. This is an Mdal file, so probably something different. Now, if this is actually the file that is going to describe your solution, right? So let me go a little bit fast now. I would create a container, as I already said. I'm going to create a container solution, and that's going to have a prefix CNT. Now, within the solution, I can already see some indications that I'm going to implement some patterns, like a pattern for ledger entry, so posting routine, a pattern for implementing my master, which could be my entity. So if I'm going to create this master thing, I would call it container. Short, abbreviated like this, maybe. And you can already see this is a template. It might implement a template description. Now, this template description, I don't know what it is. Let's see what it is in a minute. Now, I already prepared this a little bit. I would be able to do this for ledger entry and supplemental tables as well. I'm going to undo this. Oh, I can simply just delete it. And I'm going to move to an example that I already have prepared for you. So again, I have a solution, container management, with a prefix. I have defined my container master. I even already defined a supplemental table, so like a subsidiary table. A document, like a loading document, where I can put items in my container, would be nice. And a ledger entry, which indicates I might want to post from my container into a ledger entry, the container ledger entry. Yeah. Now this, as you see, is a mere 57 lines of code. Yeah. And what I can do now is run the generate AL code, which is actually something that comes from an extension within VS Code. So it's going to interpret my 57 lines of description, and it's going to create an awesome set of objects. Look at that. And this tool actually implemented quite a lot of design patterns already. So just have a look at this, at my master table. Remember, I created this container master, right? I defined few fields, but I also defined a name, template. So that name template means that I'm going to have a main name field, but also have a search name, which is going to be filled with the search name pattern, right? Even more, there are some default fields that we usually don't really think about for creating them, but it's boilerplate code. It actually should exist, all right? And some more. You see, everything is green. Everything already compiles. I've got my container table. I even have a comment line. So comments are being implemented already within my master table. I can create comments for my container. Very similar as we have seen, we can see in item table or any kind of master table that we have within Business Central. You have here the journal line. This already indicates that we will have a posting routine. So I would think that I already also have a container ledger entry. And yes, I have a container ledger entry. And if I have a container ledger entry, let's look at the code units. I probably have a posting routine as well. And look at that. There is a check line with all the boilerplate code that we need for check line routine, the post line routine, the post routine, the post yes, no. I mean, anyone that ever created this entire set that is necessary to have like just an entity with the posting routine will value this. I mean, this is a lot of coding that you need to do to make that happen, right? And a lot of trial and error, right? if I compile this, you will see it will simply compile into an app file. But that's not all. Let me go to, I will undo this now. I will delete all files, and I will go to yet another branch that extends a little bit on it. And you probably saw this popping up. So yeah, just extending with a simple line, a simple template. And the template in this tool suggests that there is some coding going on with this. So there is a template for dimension. And if I implement dimensions for this entity, container entity, I probably can now attach dimensions and also post them to my ledger entry and stuff like that. So if I would generate this code and go back to my container table, you probably will find now 2 more fields with, again, boilerplate code that is going to take care of everything that needs to be done regarding dimensions. All right. This is actually an awesome tool, and this can save you an immense amount of time, and it's going to create design patterns. It's basically going to apply design patterns to an entity that you define. You define in a simple description like this. All right. So what is that tool? The tool is an extension in VS Code. It's called Mdal, created by Jonathan Neugebauer. Sorry, my German is really bad. It's a university graduate, and he basically created this as his thesis. He is going to support it, and I'm actually planning to work together with him to even implement more patterns as already implemented. More information here on his site, and you will see it's completely described on how you need to use that. It's very simple to use. You just have to get used to it a little bit. It describes all the templates and so on that you need to know to implement that. Spend an hour on it, and you will gain days, maybe weeks of development by using this tool. As said, it's an extension in VS Code, so it's just available from the marketplace. It's still in preview, do know that. I mean, it might crash once in a while. It didn't for me, but it's still a work in progress, obviously. But any kind of feedback is always appreciated. Okay. Now, this was one tool that I really wanted to share with you. Absolutely, this, in my opinion, is very important, and it will facilitate us to create software that just works. I mean, if you create a posting routine, you probably went through a lot of trial and error to get it working. This just works. Okay. Now, preparing for this session, I actually also asked around in the community, let's call it Twitter, like, hey, what are the design patterns that you value most? And I actually was quite surprised that I got actually these 2 answers, like, yeah, this interfacing thing, this facade pattern, that's something that I really implement a lot. Now, so I do want to show you a little bit of it, and there is a reason I only want to show you a little bit of it, is because I do believe that both of these patterns are actually, since the last version of Business Central, at least from version 16, a little bit redundant. They shouldn't be implemented anymore, and I think they can be replaced by something else. So I'm not going to spend too much time on these. I just want to show them, like, they are interface patterns, and that usually solves kind of like a similar problem, being the extensibility of a certain functionality, right? And while facade pattern does that by simply having implementation code units, and if you have a new implementation, you basically just create a new code unit, right? The JSON interface pattern that was actually created by Gunnar Gestjens from Iceland. Yes, and one extra focus is to have this implementation kind of, or at least extensibility pattern, but without having a hard dependency. And what we mean with that is without having a compilable dependency, a dependency that you define in the app.json. Yeah. So to go a little bit more into that, always when I talk about the facade pattern, I always talk about scales. And yeah, in Business Central, I had to solve this particular issue a few times. Like, hey, I have a scale here. I want to get weight in some kind of business logic. Like on the item card, I want to weigh my item and then save the weight in my item. Now, this is a typical problem. I mean, customer A uses scale A, customer B uses a scale that is completely different. And how you get the weight from that scale could be through a web service for scale A or through some kind of DLL in scale B. So how you solve this problem, right? How do I make that functionality that for the item, it doesn't really matter on how you get the weight from it? Well, that's a typical implementation with the facade pattern, where the facade, and this is actually the facade, a code unit that is going to make sure to run the right other code unit to get the weight from it. So that could be like a TFL scale, let's say, that is going to get it from a DLL, maybe, that connects to the scale itself and then gets the weight and then basically just saves it to the item. Or another code unit that is going to maybe call a microservice or anything like that. It should be independent and it should be extensible. All right. So the main part here is this one, which is a code unit that decides which code unit to run for getting the right implementation in this scenario, right? It's not really a difficult pattern, and the main thing is actually just getting the right ID for the code unit to run, right? And you can already guess in a dependency scenario and in apps, if I would implement this to customer C, and customer C has yet another scale, that I will simply be able to yet create another code unit and plug it in the mechanism so that this facade code unit will find that new code unit as well. Now, to be able to create that code unit, I obviously need that hard dependency. Yeah. Now, the JSON interface pattern, I do not have an example for that. Personally, I never implemented that because I never had a focus on avoiding a certain dependency. I'm fine with dependencies. A compilable dependency being configured in the app JSON, I'm fine with that. But if you have a reason to not have these compilable dependencies, and there might be, and there probably are reasons to do that, well, then there again is a pattern to do that. Now, as said, I do not want to spend too much time on interface patterns, but I do want to suggest you to listen to yet another speaker. There is going to be an entire session on interfaces, and I do believe that this new way of being able to provide interface or to use interfaces within Business Central will replace both patterns. Yeah. Now, those were two significant answers that I got from my question, but other answers that actually talked about being able to create code that is readable, reusable, upgradable, maintainable, decoupleable, extensible. There is a lot of reason why to implement a certain pattern. So there is actually, in my opinion, one main pattern that I really want to spend my time on in this session, and that is a pattern that I have been implementing for a couple of years already. I'm still implementing this in products, in basically everything that I develop and my team develops at my company. 80, maybe 90% of the code that we create is being done with this pattern. So in my opinion, the most important pattern that we do in day-to-day basis. Yeah. And that's what we call a generic method pattern. Originally created by Gary Winter from Cloud Ready Software, and very thankfully adopted by me in my company. So let me drive you a little bit through this pattern. The main question is, where do I put code? Does it matter? Of course it matters, for all the reasons that I already have mentioned. So Stefan is going to be really happy with this pattern, I hope. And the main question that you should ask always, in my opinion, is who does what where? Where the who is the agent, the class. Class. Business Central is not object-oriented. Well, of course, Business Central is not object-oriented, but we can think a little bit in the same way, right? And maybe we cannot talk about classes, we cannot create classes, but we can create tables. And tables can create or can contain methods and fields can be properties and can be seen as properties. Methods can be seen as functions. So if I would be able to post a document like sales order.post, well, sales order is the sales header. It's a table. Post is a function on the table, right? So that is the way we should think about where to put code. But does that mean we have to put the business logic on the table? Absolutely not. And I'm going to drive you a little bit through a few pointers that is actually quite important by implementing this pattern. First pointer is encapsulation. Again, one of the things that makes object orientation actually very important and good and whatnot. And it basically just comes down to be as local as possible, encapsulate as much as possible, or make as independent as much as possible. Anything, a variable, a function, a code unit. Yeah. And it kind of comes down to, you can already see this sales header.post. Well, let's take another example, this customer.blog customer. You can already see, yes, we put a function on the table, but no, we do not put the business logic in that same table, right? It's basically just a way for us to be able to call the method of a certain class or to call the function of a certain table. Yeah, IntelliSense. IntelliSense will tell us, what can I do with this class? What can I do with this record? There is a customer, I can block it. That's information that you have if you implement it this way. Yeah. Now, even more encapsulation, every piece of business logic, so also this block customer, right, should be implemented in its own code unit, right? And you can here already see an example, and this is actually a very long list of methods that we have implemented. As said, most of the business logic we put in these kind of code units. You will see why. Now, as said, this method, this significant piece of business logic will be put in its own code unit. I mean, it should not be a management code unit like container management code unit and all methods that can be done by the container, like load and unload. This, in my opinion, should be 2 code units and not 1 container management code unit. Okay, so each method in its code unit, and it should be structured in a certain way. And it starts with only 1 global function, only 1 global function. And the rest of the functions should be local. Yeah, it's very clear. I've got my 1 encapsulated code unit that will solve this business logic, this method, and this is going to be the 1 global function that I'm going to call, in this case, block customer. I need to be able to invoke it through a class. So this is another example, purge line dot create new palette. This could be customer dot block, and this is where I can call it from wherever. So anywhere in Business Central, anywhere in my app that I need that method, I call it through the class, through the table, through the record. I'm not going to call it through the code unit. Yeah. That's encapsulation. Readability, very simply said, everything should be readable like a flowchart. So this one global function, this main function, what we always try to achieve is that a consultant, a functional consultant, is able to read it like this, right? So error if no period, I've got that twice apparently, so that shouldn't be done. Error if no posting date, error if no location, and so on and so on. And then I'm going to post and so on and commit. So this is very readable by anyone. You don't have to be a developer to be able to read this flowchart. Yeah, that makes code readable. And obviously, from the moment we dive into a certain function, obviously these are all function calls, local function calls. Well, then that's where the code becomes a little bit more nerdy, obviously. Next concept is decoupling. Immensely important, especially in an app world that we are living in today. Now, decoupling, if you make your code decouplable, then probably your code is extensible as well. And there is a lot of ways to explain decoupling or coupling. It all comes down in the degree of interdependency between routines, right? If you are familiar with code unit 80, that is a very good example of a very highly coupled code. So the highly coupled the code is, the worse your code is. Basically meaning you should make your code as independent as at all possible. Again, a reason on why to encapsulate a certain method in one code unit. Now, decouplable will also means, especially in an app world, if there is like a sales header.post or there is a customer.blog, decouplable would mean that I, as with my own app, that I'm dependent of your app, I might want to decouple the implementation of your method and implement my own business logic instead of it. Yeah. And to be able to be extensible, that's one part of it. If I would like to be able to implement a new pricing structure and there would be like a get price method, I need to be able to decouple that business logic and implement my own business logic. Okay. Now you can already see how we implemented how we can implement that. Again, we are in our encapsulated code unit, right? Our method code unit, and there is one global function. Remember, there's one global function, and that global function is always going to be implemented with this pattern. Okay, that pattern means there is a do global function. So you see here, block customer, do block customer, and that is going to be the main business logic. Remember the flow chart, the readable code, that's going to be the function with that readable code. Our consultants will be able to read the do function. Yeah. Then there is the one and only event wrapper. On before block customer, on after block customer. So on before and after. Again, this is a pattern. This is what we implement for every single method that we create. Yeah. Optionally, you would be able to implement a UI wrapper as well. Are you sure you want to execute this function? And then the acknowledge you successfully execute this function. This is UI. Usually we do not implement that, and we only implement actually these 3 lines in our company. Yeah, but do know there is the pattern can do more. Can also implement the UI. Now this on before, obviously that is where the decoupleability is. This is where I can subscribe to from an app that is dependent from this app. So this on before create this on before method. This is something that me as an dependent app can subscribe to. So I have two options here. Either I'm going to decouple it. Decouple means I'm going to implement my own business logic. Yeah, and there we have a pattern in a pattern, what we call var handled pattern. So we have this handled boolean that I can set within my dependent app, indicating like, hey, this is being dealt with. I implemented my own business logic. Yeah. So if I set that to true, it basically means I decoupled it and implemented my own business logic. And even the business logic could simply mean I disabled the business logic, right? If I basically just set the handle to true, I know that the default routine, the default business logic will not be executed anymore. Yeah. And next, other things, I do not set the handled, and then I'm basically just extending, right? I'm subscribed to the on before, and I might be adding some values to the same table, or I might be doing extra stuff to extend the business logic. So yeah, that is quite interesting. So let's see this in practice. Again, the same thing, but I just want to drive a little bit through the code so you can see how the mechanics are. First of all, we have this block method. Okay, as I said, it has got one global function and the rest is local. Yeah, and the global function is always the same pattern. There might be a UI, there might not be a UI. It's basically your choice. Usually we do not have a UI, but very important, always you have an on before and an on after. This is the extensibility, right? On before and after any method within your app, a dependent app will be able to extend on it. So just imagine that you create a product, and this product is full of methods and full of business logic, and all of these methods have this implementation. Then when you will implement your product, you will automatically have a dependent app being the customization for that customer. Or if you sell your product, you will have partners that will implement it and might have a customization app that will depend on your app. So anyone that will depend on your app will be able to extend and decouple any kind of method that you have created. Yeah. And this makes customization possible again. When we dive a little bit further, you will see here that the handled pattern is being implemented as well. So in our do function, we always have these two lines, if handled and exit. They should be there because I need to be able to trust that if I would depend or I would subscribe to this event, that actually I am able to decouple it because there is a handled. As said, this function is the only global function and should only and always be called from its agent, its class. In my case, the class is the customer. So if I go to my customer table extension, you will see here a simple call to my code unit. This is the only call to the code unit. And wherever in business logic I need to block a customer, in this case, I will simply go through the customer record. One example is obviously the test case. So I've got a test. Obviously, we create tests, right? And here I will simply just call the custom block customer. And obviously, this one will call eventually my method, my encapsulated method with the pattern that makes it extendable, decouplable, which usually also makes it maintainable, readable. So long story short, there is a main part in our code unit. There is the business part that implements my business logic. You might have that UI wrapper that you like can have a confirmation dialogue and an acknowledge dialogue, which is not really a dialogue, but anyway. Then we have this event wrapper, very important on before and after. This gives it the extensibility part. And then you might have extra events as well, like in this case, somewhere in the middle where just before I insert a record, for instance. You don't have to just keep it with 2 events. You can have as many events as you want. Everything that makes sense makes your app customizable as well. What are the benefits? First of all, this is a methodology. A methodology can be taught. A methodology can be checked, can be reviewed. That is very important. And if I can teach someone a methodology on how to think, I can teach him on how. Basically, the end result should be, if I have a problem and developer A or B is going to solve it, both are going to probably solve it completely the same way, with putting the code in completely the same places. That's what a methodology should do. It is very readable. It is decoupleable, which is very important. Extensible, which is very important. And do not forget, it's testable. Imagine that you have all your business logic in these kind of code units. Automatically, you have a list of code units that you need to test. A list of all the methods that are your tests, right? And this is actually quite an interesting list. You can just have a list of all the code units, all the method code units, and that's what you need to test. Remember that Microsoft wants you to test 80% of your code. I'm very sure if I have testability for all my method code units, that I are far beyond the 80% of the code that I tested. To conclude, I have a few resources for you. First of all, I created a dedicated DevOps repository, DevOps public project with all the demos that I have showed, with the code I have showed, and even there is also a pipeline, a build pipeline for the demos that I created. I actually didn't show you yet, but obviously one thing, I showed you the Mdal, which is going to generate some code, but even this obviously is not going to be generated by that extension. But if you have a new method that you want to work on, al.al, there is a snippet. Snippets are very important. So if I would want to create a method code unit, let's call it unblock customer, I would simply be able to create it like this, using a snippet. This is actually what our team uses daily, multiple times. Unblock, and you see here that the snippet helps me in not forgetting anything. And the entire boilerplating of the code, the entire pattern is already there. There you have it. So now I have completely compilable code, and the entire pattern is already here. All I have to do is put my business logic in the do function, and that's it, right? So this is very achievable. Now this snippet is part of the CRSL language extension, and yeah, use and abuse, I would say. Also reference to my blog. Keep close to attention to this. As I said, the wiki is outdated, it's basically old, it's not being maintained anymore. It's still a great reference. What I'm intent to do, I might be trying to start this initiative again for AL. I mean, there are a lot of interesting things regarding design patterns, and I think we need that for AL as well. And I'd be happy to contribute or maybe start an initiative like that. Well, thank you so much, and thank you for having me. And for anyone that voted on my session, I hope that it was of value for you.